Zardina Georgieva in Windsor, thank you. Now, we also spoke with three people today who are watching this situation very closely. Rob Breckenridge is the host of Global News Radio 770 CHQR in Calgary. Nigan Sinclair is a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. And John Ibbotson is a writer at large with the Globe and Mail based in Ottawa. And as we heard from Rob, public opinion on these protests is shifting.
Certainly, I think, we see that, and maybe it reflects some of the shifting public opinion, that some of this has gone too far or gone on too long. And I think the Conservatives are sort of belatedly realizing that. I mean, both sides have really tried to play the politics of this. I think for Justin Trudeau, and it even goes back to the election where, they made a real point of saying, Justin Trudeau is the leader that's going to stand up to these kinds of elements, these sort of far-right anti-vaxxers. And I think even initially here, they tried to position Trudeau as that same kind of leader, that he's going to be the one to stand up for what's right. And, the Conservatives are going to get in lead with these other people over here. I think the Conservatives, on the other hand, saw, the potential that, look, here's this mess, and we can say that this is Justin Trudeau's fault. I think to some extent they saw a movement that maybe they felt they could capitalize on. And I think belatedly both sides here realizing that, this was not well handled by the government and by the opposition. And to some extent, I think it's contributed to the overall situation. So, whether the leaders we have in place are the ones to de-escalate all of this, given the role they played, I think, in what we see here, I'm not sure. And I think, there is a problem here for both parties in terms of how do we move forward here and how do we resolve this situation.
John, I'm going to bring you into the conversation because you were at Queen's Park before you were reporting in Ottawa. We talked about the pressure on Trudeau. But I'm wondering, why did it take weeks to hear from the Ontario Premier? Because it seems much of the messaging we got from the Ford government before this week was it's the Ottawa police who are responsible.
Yeah, obviously the Ford government moved and moved swiftly once it became clear that the blockade in Windsor was having a serious impact on the Ontario economy. But Ford has, in the main, left the Ottawa situation both to the Ottawa police and to the federal government. Basically, and I've always said that Ottawa is a city that is in but not of Ontario. And the Ford government is saying, whatever happens up there, it's up to the Liberals to wear it. I think in the end, though, as I said, we're going to have to ask the nation itself how much it is prepared to stand. How important is it to people in Vancouver and Halifax and Toronto that the downtown of Ottawa is occupied by essentially a hard core of protesters, right-wing anarchists, many of them white supremacists, who want nothing less than the resignation of the government? How much does it matter to them that this carries on? Are they prepared to just shrug and say, well, nobody likes Ottawa anyway? Or are they prepared to demand that this end? If they're prepared to demand that this end, then to what extent is the Ontario government obliged to work with the federal government to put the kind of resources, the thousands of OPP, the thousands of RCMP that would be needed to supplement the Ottawa police force in order to essentially blockade the protesters and starve them out? It's not a small thing to shut down the entire downtown of a city of a million people. It would require those kind of resources. Thus far, Doug Ford doesn't seem to think the situation warrants that kind of involvement. Neither, for that matter, does Justin Trudeau believe that the federal government should get that heavily involved. When does that stop? When do the people of Canada start to say, this must end, and we're holding the politicians who can make it end accountable for their actions?
Well, I'll bring in Nigan on this. If Ottawa and if Queen's Park, the seat of the Ontario Legislature in Toronto, do not intervene more with what's happening in Ottawa, and again, we're looking at video from Windsor right now, not the situation in Ottawa, but the protest in Ottawa is now entering its third weekend. And if they do not intervene with what's happening in Parliament Hill, Nigan, does that actually embolden other protesters to keep popping up across the country?
Well, I think that as we've seen most of the other protests that involve racialized oppressed groups that have legal arguments, most of those groups have been quite reasonable, and they have been staying in places for hours at a time. And in the case of some Indigenous protests, for example, while there have been traffic slowdowns or perhaps an interruption of a rail line for 24 hours, it doesn't stay, because I think people generally understand that everyday Canadians are interested, or people want want to get each other on each other's side. These individuals don't seem to care if anyone else comes on their side, other than they're just their individual entitlements, and they're really just worried about their own selfish interests. Just furthermore to talking about the ways in which provinces are acting in relation to these protests, which are popping up all across the prairies. In Manitoba, we have right now several hundred people who are downtown. There's a blockade at the border. Same thing in Alberta. We're seeing the rise in Saskatchewan. It's been very interesting to watch this wave of right-wing premiers, conservative premiers, kind of stick handle around this issue. And most of them have taken the approach, blame Justin Trudeau, blame Justin Trudeau, blame Justin Trudeau. But at the same time, Jason Kenney and Brad Wall and Heather Stephenson here in Manitoba all have these tools at their disposal in which they can engage. In fact, Jason Kenney has the Protection of Infrastructure Act, which was Bill 1 that he passed into law, which the other premiers tried to emulate and repeat, but public outcry stopped them. But they can then get an injunction quickly. Jason Kenney can immediately stop and evoke an action to stop these protests by bringing an injunction in and then starting the process of removing individuals, seizing their vehicles legally. And he can do that in Alberta, but notice that he has not done so. Because that law was intended specifically for racialized people over the issue of pipelines. And so it's interesting to watch people like Jason Kenney, but seeing Doug Ford take an action, declare a state of emergency. I mean, we have to remember Doug Ford is in a re-election campaign. He's trying his best to appeal to the majority of Ontarians, and I think he waited to see what was the lay of the land, what is going to be the ability to get me the most amount of votes in this election, in which he's suffering greatly in the polls. And I think this is his Hail Mary. This is his move to try to get public support by taking a hard stand on what would technically be his base, individuals who would likely support his government, but he's taking a strong stand because he sees more support in the majority of Ontarians who don't support